Outlast is one of those franchises that I've always been aware of but knew very little about. I was always a fan of horror games, but I tended to lean more towards survival horror with combat and resource management, and never really played that many games where fighting wasn't an option. I think I just played one too many crappy games aping off of Outlast and Amnesia's success, and somewhat snobbishly wrote off the series as simple hide-and-seek horror made for Let's Players. The infamy surrounding the series when it comes to gore and shocking imagery also didn't endear me to it either. Violence and shocking imagery is an important part of horror, of course, but at a certain point it can get excessive and unnecessary. So upon hearing about some of the more outlandish and gruesome moments through comment sections, I dismissed the series as Saw-style exploitation. But one day, whilst looking for some horror comic books online, I noticed that there was an Outlast comic book, and it got me intrigued. Since when did Outlast have a story worth expanding into comic books? Was there more to these games than I originally thought? Were games that I essentially wrote off as glorified haunted houses really hiding a potentially interesting story? Well, this video intends to answer that question as I dive into the three main narrative entries of the series: Outlast, Outlast Whistleblower, and Outlast 2. I genuinely knew very little about these games other than maybe seeing one or two Markiplier videos on the game when it first came out back in 2013, so it's safe to say I was pretty excited to dive into a whole new horror franchise that I never really knew anything about before. And what better place to start than the original game, Outlast 1. In Outlast 1, you play as Miles Upshaw, a journalist seeking to investigate the strange goings-on at Mount Massive Asylum, after an anonymous source tips him off about potentially unethical practices being carried out by the Murkoff Corporation. Why was that so hard to say, goddammit? Although that's the initial hook, the story quickly takes a back seat as it becomes clear that the patients in the asylum have broken loose and are running amok, with your main goal simply being to survive and find your way out. The story does get more complicated, and I'll talk about my thoughts on it a little bit later, but as an initial setup, it works perfectly well. The dread of the location is built up really well, and the sudden escalation is pretty nerve-wracking and effective. I'd say that in terms of the scares, Outlast was pretty consistently tense for me, with some sections making me a lot more anxious and on edge than I was expecting. The sheer darkness of the locations without your camera is so brilliant and adds so much to the horror, and that camera you see the world through is actually the standout mechanic of Outlast and a major part of the game. When equipped, the camera allows you to zoom in or out if you wish to get a closer look at something, but more importantly, the camera comes with a night vision feature which allows you to see in the dark. This feature is incredibly useful but needs batteries in order to function properly, making batteries almost the equivalent of bullets in any other survival horror game. The night vision isn't perfect though, and in some of the more oppressively dark areas, it only just increases your visibility, meaning it isn't too overpowered. The night vision can also add to the horror as well, with it being pretty nerve-wracking to walk down a dark corridor and slowly see something come into view through this hazy green filter as the camera buzzes in the background. It genuinely gets me feeling a bit anxious at times, especially when you know someone is nearby and you can hear them moving around. I'd say that's when Outlast is at its scariest. I could take or leave some of the cheaper jump scares and the sometimes comical amounts of gore. Seriously, how many people worked in this place? There's like hundreds, if not thousands of corpses lying around. But when the game is playing on the fear of the unknown, it works really, really well and is genuinely tense. It's not at the level of like Alien Isolation, and at times the AI isn't the smartest, but it works as intended most of the time and always felt fair when it came to enemy detection. It was surprisingly fun to just evade being seen or peek around a corner into darkness, or frantically sprint after being spotted. It's simple and not usually my cup of tea, but it's effective. I will say though, I do think the twins weren't utilized enough. There's only really one encounter when you're actually running and hiding from them, and that's a pretty big disappointment when they were constantly teased throughout the game as these weird, naked, crazy brothers with machetes that wanted you dead. Having two killers chasing after you with an insta-kill machete attack would have really shaken things up in the late game, but unfortunately they just weren't utilized enough. I will say this as well, that the whole naked thing just didn't work for me. I've never really found nudity to be that scary. I just find it kind of distracting when they're walking around with their, out, but, whatever floats your boat. I think the twins being less prominent in gameplay is partly because of Chris Walker being much more prominent throughout the entire game, and I think if his screen time was cut, you could fit in a lot more other variants, and I think that could have been potentially interesting. I also really like the character backstories that you can read in the documents. I know that sounds like a minor thing, but it really did reward exploration to go out of your way and find these interesting documents that elaborate a little bit more on the backstory of the characters and Mount Massive as a place. It's good to get some of that because the actual story really doesn't focus that much on the backstory of its characters or the history of Mount Massive, so it was good to have some of that in the game. The audio design is pretty solid, and I really liked hearing the different levels of panicked breathing Miles can do, even if he does contribute to that panic breathing by shutting doors with the might of Thor. I do wish they played with diegetic sounds a little more though. Like, the music's great and really effective, don't get me wrong, but I think some of these moments would have been even better if there was just complete silence outside of echoing footsteps and some ambient environmental noises, because at times the music can be a little bit overbearing and exaggerated. Speaking of overbearing and exaggerated, let's talk about the gore. Now, don't get me wrong, I'm hardly a prude and I do love my fair share of gore and violence in games, but at a certain point it just becomes comical. I'm fine with insane levels of gore and blood, like I love Evil Dead and Brain Dead and all of these gory, cheesy, campy horror movies, but Outlast is a game that takes itself somewhat seriously, and I'd say mostly it maintains that tone well, but I can't help but roll my eyes when there's hundreds of severed heads lining bookshelves or massive piles of corpses. The game is pulpy and certainly self-aware in places, so I can't say this is too much of an issue, but it does stick out sometimes when it tries to be more serious. Scenes like Miles' finger being snipped off work for me because it's bloody but not too over the top, and it's acted incredibly well in order to sell it. But when a man has been impaled on a giant stake and suddenly springs to life in order to deliver exposition with his last breaths, it comes across a little bit ridiculous, when I think they're trying to be startling or ominous. A thing I think is done really well though is the atmosphere of the asylum itself. It feels like a real lived-in place, and reminded me a lot of Condemned Criminal Origins in places with its grainy and gritty look. I never found myself getting tired of the asylum, even if it did lack some visual variety, and I think the atmosphere definitely plays a role in that, but also the length of the game and how it doesn't outstay its welcome. It's fairly brisk, and I think with such limited gameplay and similar looking environments, I'd say that's for the best. Despite its length, it does have some memorable characters and moments, specifically when it comes to the inmates of Mount Massive. The asylum felt like an actual ecosystem, and I enjoyed hearing inmates gossip about Father Martin and whether or not they believe him or respect his authority. I think it was a good way to shake things up in terms of the encounters, as well as make the inmates feel more like actual depictions of people, albeit insane ones, as opposed to just straight up rabid animals. On the encounter side of things, never being 100% sure how someone is going to react to you is brilliant for tension, and made every moment with the inmates have you slightly on edge because you never know how they're going to react. Some are outright hostile, others will only attack if provoked, some attack only after a short amount of time, some are completely docile and ignore you, some are just afraid of you, some will attack you and then become docile, and then others will actually just be straight up helpful. It really does add to the experience and adds a lot of personality to the game. On the depiction side of things, I think showing that most of the inmates aren't hostile is a better depiction of asylum inmates than a lot of media. Don't get me wrong, it's not Silent Hill or One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest in terms of mental health depiction. There's a lot of cliches here, like twitching in corners and patients banging their heads on the walls, that almost always comes across as comical and ridiculous. But I do think at the very least, Outlast does attempt to make some of the inmates seem like victims or people we should feel sorry for. The physical deformities play into this as well. Like, yeah, I'm sure these Bioshock-esque splicer designs are supposed to be scary, but it also made me feel sympathetic for them because I just imagine what that would feel like to have that severe of a deformity. I do think there should be a little bit more variety in the models though, because you do tend to notice a lot of identical looking patients, but it's nothing too major of an issue. There is this one model though that kind of looks like a piranha, where the guy has no nose and no mouth, but has teeth somehow and is alive. Like, how do you even live without a mouth or a nose? But I don't know, it's a memorable design, so, you know, who cares? It looks cool. Back on track though, I must reiterate that I don't think it's perfect, and I wish the story focused a little bit more on the abuse of the inmates and the tragedy of institutions like this, but at the end of the day, that really isn't the story Outlast is trying to tell. The asylum and its inmates are more of a jumping off point for the real story, which is about, spoilers by the way, nanomachines?
Nanomachines, son!
Yes, I was just as confused as you are. Up until that reveal, I assumed that the story went like this. A drug company called the Murkoff Corporation decides to use an asylum in order to experiment on its patients with a new drug or bioweapon that makes people violent and rabid, with plans to sell this drug or bioweapon to militaries or terrorists for money. I assumed that the physical deformities of these inmates were a side effect of these experiments, and that Chris Walker was one of the quote-unquote success stories, with his one-track mind for killing and enhanced physical strength perhaps being the ideal outcome for what the corporation wanted from these experiments. When Chris Walker talks about keeping something contained or not letting something get out, I assume that that was him parroting the orders of the corporation, and that the reason he tries to kill Miles is so the experiments are never leaked to the public on orders from Murkoff. When it came to the Walrider, I believe that it was some kind of supernatural entity and was created from the combined suffering caused by the experiments. That's why the inmates pray to it like this deity. They've all suffered because of the experiments, so they see this vengeful spirit as their liberator. It really wasn't until like the last moment where I fully got what was happening. In case you need a recap, essentially the Murkoff Corporation used Mount Massive Asylum and its patients for experimentation. But rather than some kind of bioweapon or drug, the inmates were tested to see if they would be compatible with nanotechnology. A young man named Billy Hope was found to be compatible, but the nanomachine technology started disobeying Murkoff and became independent, eventually killing Murkoff employees and attempting to escape into the wider world. After the former head of the experiments, Dr. German Nazi Man, tells this all to Miles, Miles kills Billy, thus stopping the Walrider, although as he's about to leave, he is gunned down by security. As Miles lays dying, however, the Walrider suddenly finds him and picks him as the new host, with the Walrider then going on to kill the Doctor and the security, with the game ending right there. First off, not a great way to end the game by killing off the main character with no closure whatsoever. I know it's a horror game, but I've just never really liked these kinds of pessimistic endings in media. It just feels like a waste of time. Like, you've played this game, you filmed all these events, and it's just been for nothing, I guess. I also have a few questions about this story overall. Keep in mind that I'm saying this only having played the first game as of right now, so if this is answered in Whistleblower or 2, I will address it later in the video, but as of right now, these are just my raw, immediate thoughts. Why experiment on insane people? I understand the logic that no one would bother investigating because the patients are insane, so nothing they say could be incriminating, but the risk of mentally unstable people controlling nanomachines seems obvious. I feel like there would definitely be people in the military or working at the corporation who would volunteer to do these experiments if it meant a large sum of money or some kind of breakthrough in technology. They're also a lot less likely to just go completely postal as soon as they gain control of these deadly nanomachines. If insanity or some kind of ability unique to the mentally ill is required in order to control these nanomachines telepathically, then why even bother with the telepathy angle? I get that it would make it the ultimate killing machine or whatever, but the risk of having an insane person get control of technology like that is insane, especially when you could just, I don't know, make it controlled at a console or a computer or something. If this company is able to invent nanotechnology, I'm sure they could figure out a way to connect a DualShock to it. Come on. Why does Miles, of all people, become the Walrider? I get that he went through a lot of trauma over the course of the game, but unless we learn some backstory about his life or childhood in other games, I don't see why he would be the one who's chosen as the new host over any of the other insane inmates. Maybe if we had some hallucinations and visual indicators that Miles was going insane, it would feel a little less jarring that he becomes the Walrider. Maybe a similar style insanity mechanic to Amnesia would have worked, but as it is right now, I don't really see why he's the one who is perfect for becoming the Walrider. Is it because he killed Billy and became the new master of the nanomachines? Why would that even be a feature? I thought that the nanotechnology could only work if there was a host, and with Billy Hope dead, surely that would mean the nanomachines would just fall on the ground. Unless they really are alive, it's a little confusing. I think my main issue though is just I've never been fond of technology that's basically magic. Unless you go full on goofy and absurd with the concept, I feel like it's just a cop-out way of doing magic without technically doing it. Overall, although I definitely have some issues, I was pleasantly surprised by Outlast 1. It stumbles in certain areas and doesn't fully live up to its potential, but I genuinely found it to be pretty tense and immersive as an experience. It has so many great sequences, performances, and characters, along with a standout camera mechanic that injects some longevity in what would otherwise be a pretty stale formula. It's like a slightly more open haunted house experience, and I mean that in the best way possible. In short, I can see why this game took off in the way it did, and why it's so influential to a lot of horror games that came after. Even a game like Resi 7 feels like it has some Outlast DNA in it. Hopefully the success of Outlast 1 translated into some good games, or in the case of Whistleblower, good DLC. But there's only one way to find out, so let's head straight into it. In Whistleblower, you play as Wayland Park, an employee working at the Murkoff Corporation who decides to blow the whistle on all the unethical experiments taking place at Mount Massive Asylum. He's actually the person who sent the anonymous tip to Miles in the beginning of the first game, and I think it's a great way to tie this DLC to the main game. Upon sending the email, you are quickly found out by security and thrown in with the rest of the patients and experimented on. An unknown amount of time later, all hell breaks loose as the Walrider causes havoc, allowing Wayland to free himself from his restraints and attempt to escape from Mount Massive. It's relatively simple, a lot like the first game, and remains so for the most part, with the story running alongside the events of the first game and then giving the story a semi-definitive conclusion. I think there are a lot of great moments throughout, but also some things I'm a little bit more mixed mixed on, but let's just start with the positives first. If there's one thing Outlast has nailed so far, it's pacing and atmosphere, and that trend continues with Whistleblower. The atmosphere of Mount Massive is still great, and despite it still looking fairly similar to the original, I didn't find myself getting bored. On the story front, I really enjoyed the increased human element. Like, you actually get to see some non-experimented on humans interact with each other and deal with the situation unfolding, and I thought that was really interesting. I think they could have played on this a little bit more, maybe by having some more inmate and Murkoff employee interactions, and you do get a little bit of that, but I think it could have been pushed a little bit more. The main corporate villain, Jeremy Blair, is suitably hateable, but I think he should have shown up a little more often, because he does kind of get overshadowed by a villain that I'll get to a little bit later. I also enjoyed that since you yourself are a patient, other people react to you that way, like certain NPCs upon seeing you run away, implying that you now look like one of those experimented on inmates. It adds a little bit more sympathy and tragedy to the story, and I really like that. I do think there was a little bit of a missed opportunity to explore that a little bit more and the effects of the experimentation overall. Like, other than the pattern appearing occasionally, there isn't really much done when it comes to hallucinations or showing what the experiments actually have an effect on. I feel like you could have done a lot of cool and creatively creepy stuff with that concept, but it doesn't really get explored that much. I also do kind of wish there was some new addition to the gameplay, because the DLC doesn't do much to shake up the formula. It's still effective, and the strengths of that gameplay loop persist into the DLC, but most DLC usually add at least one new item or mechanic to expand on the experience, but Whistleblower doesn't do that, and I would have appreciated something new being added. Maybe you could have encountered those armed PMC soldiers in a more open stealth section, with the fact they have firearms making stealth your only option, adding a new layer of challenge to the encounters. There's also a weird thing which screams cut content to me, which is the character Dissociative Dennis. He's this character you meet just before the groom, and he has quite a bit of build-up and a document detailing his condition, but when you meet him, he looks like any other inmate and you breeze right past him. I feel like something interesting could have been done with the 4 personalities thing. Maybe the AI would swap between them at random, making him behave differently depending on who was the dominant personality. Maybe one is slower speed-wise but can kill you instantly, maybe another is faster but weaker to compensate for it, and maybe another could be completely docile and actually try to warn you to stay away from him. I know this is a bit of a tangent, but it just stuck out to me, and I imagine that there were plans for further stuff to be done with him, but there's only so much that you can fit into a DLC. Even with the injustice done against my boy Dennis, I really do like the buzzsaw cannibal guy you run into earlier in the DLC. He's simple and effective. Generic and cliche, sure, but I don't know, he got my heart racing sometimes. I'm a little bit more mixed on the groom, however, who's arguably the most memorable part of this entire DLC. I think he's effectively creepy and really well performed, with the sections where you're running and hiding from him in gameplay being effectively tense and nerve-wracking. My main issue with him though is the excessive shock violence. The infamous table scene was one that I knew about going in, and it isn't too bad, but the build up to it is the real issue. That body you see before encountering him is done in poor taste, in my opinion. It felt like something an edgy teenager would come up with. What if a dude had his cut off and had a giant ball that was and then he had some shoved up like he's pregnant, dude? That would be gnarly and edgy as shit. His dialogue is creepy enough and paints the picture of what exactly he does just fine. We didn't need to see it in graphic detail. It didn't make him scarier or improve the game in any way. It was just gross and unnecessary, and I just kept thinking of the developers having to model every detail of it, and I felt kind of bad. It stopped the game from feeling like a fun haunted house and was totally unnecessary. The table scene works so much better because a lot of it is just implication. I could take or leave the actual nudity, but just seeing the blood and having the groom describe it paints the picture fine. We didn't need that build up where he's just killing people on it and doing unnecessarily shocking things. It's just yet again unnecessary and kind of a waste of time. The doctor cutting off your fingers in the first game is infinitely more pulpy and fun, and is a much better example of doing a character like that well without being too gratuitous. To change the tone a bit, I did really like the ending, and it was actually somewhat positive, with the corporate dude getting killed by the Wall Rider, Miles being shown as the Wall Rider then leaving the asylum to be at peace, and Waylon actually escaping and exposing the whole conspiracy. It's a bit of a shame that Whistleblower is practically mandatory in order to see an actual decent ending for the first game's story. Whistleblower definitely feels like it could have been a part of the original game, and I'm not sure if it's a case of, we didn't have enough time to put this stuff in the first game, so let's put it in a DLC, or let's deliberately give people a shitty ending for Outlast 1 so they'll be forced to buy the DLC. I'm not entirely sure which one is the case, but I'm hoping it's the former. Overall though, I can't be too harsh on Whistleblower. As a DLC for an already short game, I get that it probably couldn't expand too much on what the base game did, and that's totally fine. fine. I did enjoy my time overall, even if it suffers from some of the same issues as the base game, but amplified even more in my opinion. I think that Asylum setting and its character-based set pieces are such a key part of the enjoyment, so I'm curious about how I'll react to Outlast 2, which to my knowledge doesn't take place in the Asylum whatsoever. I'm curious to see where you'd go with the story after the events of Outlast 1, and even though I'm not the biggest fan of the nanomachine twist, it is at the very least unique, and I think a lot of interesting stuff could be done with it. With all that being said, let's just head straight into Outlast 2. In Outlast 2, you play as cameraman Blake Langerman, who one day whilst aiding his wife with reporting on the disappearance of a pregnant girl, crash lands with her on a helicopter into the American wilderness, and wakes up shortly after to find her missing. The game then follows Blake's run-ins with religious cults as he attempts to rescue his wife. Alongside this, he also experiences hallucinations and visions connected to a traumatic event in his childhood. Now, I'm not exactly sure what the general consensus surrounding Outlast 2 is, but I have to say that although starting off fine enough, I found this game to be utterly miserable. It's genuinely one of the more disappointing things I've played in recent memory, and I just can't see why this was the direction taken. Before getting into that though, I will start with some positives. I like some of the new gameplay additions, like interactable windows, locks on doors, crawling, and a directional microphone for the camera. It's at least something to shake up the regular formula, but not enough in my opinion. I like that you can actually re-watch some of the videos you've recorded on your camera, although I do wish it was less situational and you could just watch through regular segments of gameplay. The UI is also a little bit clunky and not as clean and snappy as the original, but it's still a cool idea in concept. The bandages mechanic is cool conceptually too, but I just never really found myself needing to use it that much outside of mandatory sequences. But I'll get onto the difficulty of the game a little bit later. The school segments early on were actually kind of creepy. They did drag on a bit and I think they could have been used a little less frequently, but they did unnerve me early on and pretty effectively. But the more they get used, the less effective they are. The pickaxe lady has a cool voice, I guess, and the voice acting overall is pretty decent, but the characters and performances in Outlast 1 and Whistleblower are still leagues more memorable and fun. And I think that's it. Yeah, for me this was such a step down from the original, it's unreal. There's a lot I want to talk about and justify, so let's just start off with the gameplay to keep things simple before delving into the story. In my opinion, the gameplay loop of Outlast does not suit a game almost twice as long as the original. The reason the first game worked so well was because it was a well-paced series of scares channeled through claustrophobic environments, with constant movement and momentum when it comes to the story and events. Outlast 2, in contrast, is much more open and meandering, but does little to change the gameplay formula to adjust to this. You still approach enemies in the exact same way as the first game, but minus the more claustrophobic design that added some difficulty. For a sequel which demands a lot more of your time, you have to do something to shake things up and make the gameplay more engaging. The AI also didn't feel any smarter than the original. They had predictable behavior, were way too easy to avoid, and lacked the uniquely grotesque designs of the original. I knew how every encounter was going to go down, and I can't say I felt the same for the first game because of its unpredictable inmates. But here, they all feel like the same copy-pasted generic religious cultist hicks. Outside of crawling, windows, locks on doors, and a directional mic, nothing is added to shake things up. For as much as I would like every game to have some Condemned style combat, I know that isn't what they're going for, which is fine, but if you are going to commit to the stealthy, no attacking enemies thing, you have to shake things up a little bit more. What about being able to throw bottles to cause distractions or temporarily stun enemies? What about some kind of insanity mechanic where you lose sanity the longer you stay in the dark or the more horrific things you witness? What about some kind of temperature mechanic which forces you to huddle around campfires or sources of heat when it gets cold? What about some sections where you don't have your camera but instead a torch where you have to keep it shielded from the wind in order to keep it lit? These are all kind of random suggestions, I know, but for me, if you're going to expand upon the linear design of the original, then expand the gameplay to suit that. And I'm not talking about adding gimmicky sections like that terrible raft section. A complete waste of time that isn't fun to control and contributes nothing to the game. It could be cut out entirely and the game would be better for it. Another thing that kind of relates to gameplay is the protagonist Blake. In Outlast 1 and Whistleblower, the protagonists were silent, and other than one or two instances where it seems out of place, it mostly worked. These are games about being alone and hiding from your pursuers, so of course you aren't going to narrate to yourself constantly. Blake, on the other hand, though, is the complete opposite of that. He will not only speak out loud to himself when he's potentially in danger, but most obnoxious of all, he will force feed the player exactly what they should be thinking or feeling. His commentary after sometimes genuinely impactful cutscenes just ruins any potential they had.
They called them heretics. They called Lynn mother. It's not just a cult. It's two sides. Christians and something else.
Like, I get what the cutscene was trying to tell me, I don't need this guy to drill it into my head any further. Onto a more nitpicky thing though, I really didn't like the horribly intrusive flashing video or picture icon when you film a notable event. The ring was already overkill when the original did it in a much subtler way, but having the game beat you over the head with how you just recorded an important thing or filmed an important document is just dumb. I also just don't like having control taken away. Like, maybe I don't want to instantly throw out my camera when reading a note and waste my battery life. Okay, that is pretty nitpicky, but still. I didn't even really think the game had much atmosphere either. There are moments here and there, but somehow it felt less gritty and grungy than the original game. That could be because of the literal lack of film grain on the screen, but these environments just don't compare to Mount Massive and aren't nearly as interesting to explore. They feel like they could be plucked from any other horror game, and I don't get the same unique feeling I did when exploring the first game's decaying and archaic asylum. Also another nitpicky thing, but why doesn't Blake just pick up some farm tools or bottles or something at any point in the story? You could levy this complaint at the first game as well to some extent, but one, the first game was fun enough and fast-paced enough to where I didn't even think to question things like this, and two, Mount Massive is a much smaller area and most of the weapons have already been taken by the inmates. But you're telling me not a single cultist left a potential weapon on the floor or in their house that Blake could pick up? Not a single one? The rooms are full of cutlery and bottles, and Blake doesn't think to pick this shit up. Now, I know that's a nitpick and very cinema sins, but it just demonstrates how much less engaging the game was for me when I was asking questions like this. Questions that I never really asked in Outlast or Whistleblower because they were so fast-paced and fun. I also think the notes and documents you pick up are worse. In the first game, when you picked one up, it was almost always something comprehensible and relevant to something you just encountered or saw. But a majority of the notes in 2 are just jumbled religious nonsense. I get that you have to throw in some crazy speak from time to time, but how am I supposed to learn about these characters and this world when I can't discern nonsense flavor text from actually important, potentially interesting stuff? And that's the thing, a lot of the ideas in Outlast 2 I actually quite like and find potentially interesting, but it just didn't grip me in the way that the first game did. For as mixed as I am on the nanomachine twist from the first game, I can at the very least say that I've never really seen anything like it, which isn't something I can say about Outlast 2, which I found pretty predictable in places. We've seen this cult, destined child plotline a million times, and unless you really do something interesting to shake it up, it's just going to come across as generic and predictable as any other story like this. And look, like I've said, there are some cool ideas. Like, I think the idea of pushing Christianity to its absolute extremist limit is potentially interesting, but outside of the shock stuff, we don't really learn much about the ins and outs of the religion. Like, why did these religions even spring up in the first place? This is the modern United States. People aren't going to just drop their entire life and go live naked in a cave covered in mud for the rest of their lives. I honestly thought that idea of these people being so unexplainably fanatical would play into the plot somehow. Like, I thought that maybe the Murkoff Corporation had bought out a rural poor town or even just built their own and created a device or technique to induce extreme loyalty or obsession. I thought the flashing light you see from time to time was going to be connected to that, and the people in this place have been influenced by it to become mindless extremist zombies. That's why the religions are so comically evil. Murkoff is testing how far they can go with this method of mind control or behavior alteration by pushing the absolute limits of human empathy. Like, killing hundreds, if not thousands, of children goes against all human nature, and I genuinely thought the only way people would go through with something like that is because of MK Ultra style experiments from Murkoff. But I guess people there are just crazy because? No talk of experimentation or madness-inducing lead in the water or some kind of curse. They're just crazy because it's an Outlast game and you need crazy people. The game didn't even really explore the conflict between the two religions that much. Other than a few scenes early on, we never see that much interaction between the heretics and Noth's people, and it's such a missed opportunity for potentially interesting conflict. And speaking of the religious angle, since when was that Outlast's main thing? Religion is absolutely a theme of 1 and Whistleblower, but that's mostly just because of Father Martin, and the rest of the story is more concerned with corporate conspiracy and exploitation. And of course I have nothing against exploring religion in media, but if you aren't going to do something super interesting with it, then why even bother? I just think that if you're going to call the game Outlast 2, some elements of that original story should carry over. Like, I was genuinely shocked when by the end of the game, no one had mentioned Murkoff or Mount Massive in any substantial way. Why not just make this its own game? It's already pretty disconnected from the Outlast series, so why even call it Outlast 2? 2. Okay, I know why they called it Outlast 2, but still. It does carry over one tradition from Outlast though, which is shitty endings, so let's just get into this. After going through all the shit you go through in the campaign, both in the school hallucinations and in the real world, you rescue your wife, but then she dies in childbirth because she's suddenly 9 months pregnant, even though there was no indication of that previously. And then Noth shows up, you know, somebody who kills children regularly, but decides not to kill this baby who he thinks is the Antichrist because I guess it's too late. Not even gonna give it a try. It's like your whole thing. But instead of doing that, Noth just kills himself because he's like, oh, we're fucked now. And then Blake just walks out of the church and you're like, oh, at least the game's gonna end happily. And then the entire world explodes, or the sun explodes, or that light explodes, and then the game just ends. What does this even mean? What have we learned or gained from this experience? And what does this ending say about anything? Is it supernatural? Is the reason Blake's wife suddenly pregnant supernatural? It has to be, right? But then where was this paranormal stuff in the first game? What does the world exploding mean? Was Noth right? So what's the message or the takeaway? Believe the extremist preacher because he might be right? What did the flashing lights mean? How did the story at the school connect with the main plot, other than the idea that people in religious positions of power do bad things? If I'm really pushing it, maybe Blake not intervening to help his friend is the reason why his wife died, because of some kind of karmic justice, and the baby represents a new start, but then the world just explodes, so that kind of goes out the window. Maybe that flashback at the end isn't actually a flashback, and it's instead Blake traveling back in time to go back into his own body when he was younger to save his friend? Or maybe that's all a dream or a death hallucination? It's so unnecessarily complicated, and I'm sure it's explained in comic books or something else, but just taking the game as it is, playing it through normally, picking up most notes, I didn't get it at all. It just felt like it was vague for the sake of it, so you never have to actually explain any details because, oh, it's all vague, it's pretentious, it's all this. You're not supposed to get it. I think there are some well-executed sequences isolated from the rest of the story, absolutely, but it just did not come together for me in any interesting or entertaining way. I know I sound kind of miserable saying all this, but that's just because the game itself is so miserable. The first game definitely had its serious moments, but it was mostly pulpy, fun, and somewhat self-aware, and knew exactly what it was trying to do and exactly what it was. But this game thinks it's being this insane, provocative, shocking, mind-bending story, but in reality, it's just boring. I've played tons of depressing and sad games, but even the most depressing games have some kind of levity, whether it be through completing a puzzle, finding some supplies you need in a tucked away area, or overcoming a combat challenge. But Outlast 2 has none of that. I never felt rewarded for exploration with much needed supplies because I never ran low on batteries or bandages, and the areas themselves are fairly small, so I would just sometimes stumble across things purely by accident. And the notes that you can find when you go out of your way are, as previously discussed, not that interesting. I never felt that I had to overcome a particularly difficult enemy encounter because you handle every enemy in the exact same way. And because of the more open design of this game, you can just sprint around enemies easily and don't even need to engage with stealth. And the enemies for the most part aren't even faster than they were in the original to compensate for this. So without any rewarding or engaging gameplay, I was just left with a story that was relentlessly miserable. And if you're going to be that miserable, you either have to be 1, masterfully written, or 2, mercifully short, neither of which I would describe Outlast 2 as. In conclusion, Outlast 2 is a terrible misstep. For every positive I can list, there are 5 more negatives to cancel it out. It ignored everything I liked about the first game and doubles down on all the worst aspects whilst adding a long, boring, miserable story that has nothing to say that I feel hasn't already been said far better before. It said I have to end the video on a negative note, but I guess that's the interesting thing about Outlast. It's not really my favorite thing ever. Most of the things I cover on this channel I have a deep affection for, or at the very least some kind of childhood connection. But Outlast is the complete opposite of that in many ways. I uncharacteristically decided to cover this series on a whim and with no idea if I would like it or not, and it's turned out that I'm probably leaning more negative when it comes to Outlast as a whole. But don't get me wrong, I was still surprised by how much I liked that first game, flaws and all, and I really do think it was lightning in a bottle in certain aspects. It's just a shame that for me personally, nothing past that original game has leaned into the things I like about Outlast that substantially. And what exactly is it that I like about Outlast? Well, I'd say that Outlast at its best is an atmospheric haunted house boss with a dark backstory. Not every game needs to change the world or reinvent the wheel, and I think that's what Outlast 1 understood. It gave you some well-written lore and an interesting backstory if you wished to read up on it, but if not, you could always just switch off your brain, switch off the lights, and enjoy an immersive, spooky experience with all the tropes of a pulpy horror movie and some genuine thrills along the way. And with that in mind, I think Outlast did its job marvelously, and I can only hope that future entries in the series look back on the first one and see what went well. Anyway, with all that being said, I'm Christian Cries, and thanks for watching. So here we are in the post-talk discussion of the video. This is an interesting one because, like I said, with most of the videos I do on this channel, they tend to end positively. Even Callisto Protocol, which was probably my most negative-leaning video, it still ends with me recommending the game and being positive about it. But this was a little bit different, and I still recommend the first game. I think the first game is a lot of fun. Maybe give Whistleblower a go if you're, if your stomach for that type of thing is, if you can handle it. I still enjoyed Whistleblower overall. It was just, I soured on it a little bit when it got too shocking and sort of edgy. But Outlast 2 I would not recommend. And I mean, look, if you enjoy Outlast 2, all the power to you. You know, you get another Outlast game that you like, so I would never, hate on it on purpose or hate somebody for liking it. I didn't connect with the story. I didn't think the gameplay evolved in an interesting way, and I think just for my sensibilities personally, I think if you're going to do a longer game, I needed something a little bit more than just that Outlast 1 formula expanded slightly. But look, I did enjoy these games and I enjoyed playing them, and Outlast 1 I'm always going to respect as like a go-to game that if you've got a friend over and you want to scare them, you put on Outlast 1. It's a simple but effective haunted house of a game in the best way possible, and it deserves props. But what I'm finding interesting is that after Outlast 2, the series I've been reading into the series after obviously writing the script, but it sort of went quiet for a bit, and it was only recently where it's had sort of a renaissance with Outlast Trials. Now, I don't know much about this, but the reason I haven't covered it is it seems to be more of a multiplayer-focused game, kind of like your Dead by Daylights or your Texas Chainsaws or your Friday the 13th and all that shit. I mean, that's a video for a whole other day. My hatred for the take a horror franchise and turn it into a multiplayer thing and try to ape off the success of Dead by Daylight. I absolutely hate it, and maybe that's a video for another day. But besides that, it didn't really seem like a game that was all narrative, and I have seen little bits and clips from it, and it does seem like it appeals more to a multiplayer type of thing. And really, on this, I wanted to focus on the main narrative entries of the series, so I left it out for that purpose. And plus, it's in early access, and it's a PC exclusive, so I'm not really sure if it's being treated as like, oh, this is the next Outlast game. It's like, this is a side thing you can enjoy whilst they work on Outlast 3, which I am curious about. I don't know if I really don't know anything about what Outlast 3 will be, because, when I search Outlast 3, it just says Outlast Trials, but I have looked on I have seen around that they actually announced Outlast Trials as being, like, the thing that will tide people over until Outlast 3, so I'm curious what Outlast 3 will do exactly, because I know Outlast Trials goes back to Mount Massive, or is at the very least connected in some way, so I wonder if the third one will be, or if it will be, like, 2 and just be completely disconnected. Really, I don't know. But the main takeaway here is just, thank you so much if you enjoyed the video. Subscribe to the video, as always. Hit like on the channel. Send a tip over on coffee if you enjoyed the video in particular. 3 quid, 4 quid, 5 quid, whatever. But thank you very, 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 very much for watching and for the continued support. And thanks a lot, and love you guys. Bye.